So that without presenting Jakob, who needs not to be presented, I will give him the floor for the last presentation, and then I will try and keep you a few minutes for a range of summary of questions and conclusions. Jakob, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Pierre-Etienne. You can go to the next slide. Okay, I will talk about, no, one before, the title, please. I will talk about the railway noise mitigation framework in Europe and how the policies can be combined with the concerns of the railways so that we can come up with good research programs. Next slide. I will proceed as follows. I will first explain why this is an issue. Then I will go into the European strategies and policies, talk about the WHO guidelines, briefly state some national strategies and policies, then switch over to the railway concerns and requirements. And finally come up with some conclusions for research. Next slide, please. Why is this an issue? Well, on the one side, we have policies by the European Union, national policies, we have international organizations, and of course, we have the concerns by line-side inhabitants. On the other side, we have railway concerns and requirements, for example, by operators or infrastructure companies. And these two don't always mesh. So we have to figure out some way to combine them so that we can come up with good research programs. Next slide. Okay, what is the European strategy and policy? We heard about this a bit yesterday, so I'll be very brief. The EU considers railways a sustainable means of transportation that should be promoted. And because of that, noise mitigation should be undertaken without reducing the competitiveness of the railways. The main measure is retrofitting of the freight rolling stock, and this works because composite brake blocks cause less wheel roughness than do cast iron brake blocks. The next slide. Out of this, the EU Commission has started several actions. One of them is the revision of the TSI noise, where only silent trains are allowed on so-called quieter routes starting 2024, and quieter routes are routes with 12 or more trains per night. Then also noise differentiated track access charges are possible. Then with the Connecting Europe facility, some 20% funding was available to retrofit more than 200,000 wagons. The Environmental Noise Directive, END, calls for noise mapping and action plans. And the Shift to Rail project we just heard about, so I will not go into it. The next slide. Let's switch to the WHO guidelines. These were published for the European region in 2018. The recommendations for railway noise are based on studies with a low or moderate quality, and that qualification, low and moderate, are not my words, but rather the words of the WHO guidelines themselves. Nonetheless, the recommendations are strong. The recommended limit values, which call for an LDEN of 54 decibels and an LNIT of 44 decibels, are much too low and cannot be carried out or realized with realistic measures. At least that is the opinion of the railways. However, the values are comparable with those of the road sector. Now let's just look at the conclusions for research just from the WHO guidelines, because I believe that there are more studies on noise which should be carried out. And if you consider the billions of euros that are the consequence of these studies, I think they should have a high quality and not a low or moderate quality. However, if the recommendations are proven correct, then we would require a lot more measures, probably much more of the same, more noise barriers mostly, or new novel measures would have to be developed. And that's where research comes in. The other thought about this is that the resources spent on noise mitigation should be put into a context with effects on other health areas. So we have to be sure that the euro that we spend on noise control couldn't be better spent in some other health area. Let's go to the next slide. Let me go through some countries quickly. In Germany, there is a ban of freight wagons, which started last December. This ban is in conflict with the TSI noise, and this conflict has not been resolved as far as I am aware. Then there are subsidies for retrofitting freight wagons. There are noise differentiated track access charges, and a major program for noise barriers and insulated windows has been started. And also, as quite a number of rail dampers are being installed. In Switzerland, there is also a ban on noisy freight wagons, which is already more than a year old. This is also in conflict with the TSI noise, a conflict that also has not been resolved. Then retrofitting, the replacement of cast iron brake blocks with composite brake blocks, is complete and financed by the government. Noise differentiated track access charges are in place, and there is a major program for noise barriers and insulated windows, which is complete. In Austria, numerous barriers are being built, and also there's a program of noise differentiated track access charges. The next slide, please. In the Netherlands, they have a system of permissible noise emissions for each line. Also, noise barriers are being installed, rail dampers also, as well as a system of noise differentiated track access charges. In Italy, quite a few noise barriers are being built, and there are subsidies for retrofitting. And this list could go on and on and on. And there are programs in France, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and many more. However, they are largely absent in some EU countries, such as Bulgaria or Romania. Next slide, please. Now I will cross over to the railway concerns. The main concern of the railways is competitiveness, and the main competitor is the road sector. So the cost for noise mitigation should be kept as low as possible, or the benefit should be as large as possible. Then we have to worry about trade-offs. For example, one trade-off is between asset management and noise mitigation. One classic example is the stiffness of rail pads. For example, if you have stiff rail pads, then you have less noise, but higher LCCs because you need more maintenance. On the other hand, if you have soft rail pads, you have less maintenance, but you have more noise. And you have to find some sort of a compromise between the two. Then it is important that we maintain the traffic capacity of the network. For example, if operational measures are considered, such as speed reduction as a noise mitigation method, that reduces the traffic capacity radically, especially if the trains have different speeds. In contrast to a motorway, one train cannot pass another train very easily. Then we should reduce the risk of disrupting the service. If you want to install and maintain a noise measure, you have to disrupt the service. That's a problem. And also every additional component has a risk of failure. And if we have to undertake repairs, again, we disrupt the service. Then whatever we install must be compatible with other elements of infrastructure. For example, we need sufficient room for maneuvering. We need a distance to electrical installations. Then track diagnostics should remain available. For example, we should be able to measure the rail profile. And we have noticed in some cases that this is difficult if rail dampers are attached to the rail. Next slide, please. The list of railway concerns goes on. The availability of construction crews and safety personnel must be guaranteed, and this is an increasing problem. We must be able to access the railway lines. For example, noise measures are often in built-up areas. This means that the access is already difficult, and if we add noise barriers, the access becomes even more difficult. Then we should avoid damage and vandalism. Graffiti, we would like to avoid that. Safety of products must be adhered to. Then there are certain product requirements. We need long lifespans. The product should be moisture, UV radiation resistant, also resistant to chemicals. And we should also not forget that for each new project, know-how must be generated and new dependencies on industry are created. Then, no matter what happens, we require minimal maintenance and replacement costs. Please go to the next slide. So where do we stand? On the one side, we have the policies. Railways are often promoted. Generally, there's a tendency towards more noise reduction. There's some financing for research. On the other side, we have the railway concerns and requirements. We have competitiveness that is important, trade-offs with LCCs, capacity of the network that must be considered, maintenance issues, damage and vandalism that must be reduced, access to the track that must be guaranteed, as well as safety issues. So let's put all of this together and come up with some conclusions for research. The next page, next slide, please. The most important one is that noise control measures should not reduce competitiveness of the railways. So whatever we develop, it should be either cheap or have a very large benefit. We can do this if we try to optimize the whole system. So we shouldn't only be looking at noise, we should also be looking at maintenance, for example. It is useful to work with the existing components of the track rather than adding new ones. Then we should take the whole railway framework into account. That is operation, construction, and safety. A good first step is to understand the system as well as we can. We should understand the dynamics and the interactions between the components. Then it is important to critically appraise the promises by manufacturers of new measures. These are often way larger than what we see in the field. We should also critically appraise the science behind annoyance studies. If you imagine the consequences in the billions of euros based on this science. And I mentioned this earlier, we should have some sort of health effects that are put into a larger context. So we shouldn't only look at noise, but also, if not, that money would be better spent in other health areas. And I think it is useful if you are starting a research project to cooperate with the railway sector in as early a stage as possible. So contact your infrastructure manager or your operator. Next slide. So if you want more information, let me once again tell you that we have all sorts of state-of-the-art reports, and the newest one, which was published yesterday, please download it and for free on the UIC homepage. And with that, on the next slide, please, I would like to thank you for your attention.